hand clamped over a pup's mouth before he could scream. Blood ran down the back of her wrist. 3 torches moved along the ridge above the cave, swinging in slow arcs, and she counted them under her breath. She did not breathe again until they passed. Then she eased the pup back into the moss, pressed 2 fingers under his jaw, and felt the small drum of a heart that wanted to live. 22 more lay behind her in the dark. One of them was missing 2 toes. Another had a sword cut that ran from his shoulder to his hip, stitched with thread she had pulled out of her own coat. She wiped her hand on her thigh, and the blood went black in the firelight. Her name was Lyra Vane. The pack that had thrown her into the snow did not know she was still alive. Stay with me on this one. The cave was called Hollow Reach by the old wolves who still remembered names for things. It sat halfway up a canyon wall above the Bonecrest River, behind a curtain of dead vines and a rockfall that looked from below like it had no opening at all. Lyra had found it when she was 9 years old. She had been running from a beating then too. She remembered crawling through the gap on her belly and lying in the dark for a whole night, listening to her own breath, certain that something would come for her. Nothing had. She had taken that as a promise. She moved through the cave the way she moved through her own body, with a careful awareness of every weak place. The pups lay in 3 rows along the back wall. She had wrapped each one in whatever she could find. Wool from a dead trader's coat, the lining of a saddle blanket, strips torn from her own shirt. She knew their names already. The youngest was Bren. He was 4. The oldest was Kessa, who was 11 and would not stop trying to stand watch. There was Tomas with the burned hands. There was Ayla with the wrong-shaped jaw. There were 3 brothers from the river hamlet, whose mother had died with an axe in her shoulder, telling Lyra to run. There was a girl who had not spoken since the second night, and Lyra had stopped trying to make her. She just laid a hand on the child's hair every time she passed. She had been disowned at 22. That was 18 months ago. The Ashfall Pack elders had voted in a circle around her, and her own father had broken the floor stone with his cane and called her unmade. No mate. No name. No protection. She had walked out of the hall barefoot in November. She had survived by hunting alone, by drying her own meat, by trading skins to half-blind smugglers who did not ask questions. She had learned to sleep with one ear above the blanket. She had learned to set a snare in the dark. She had learned to need no one. She thought she had been ready for anything. She had not been ready for the slaughter at Westmarsh. Believe me, no one is ready for a thing like that. Not even the people who live in the country where it happens. Westmarsh was a farming village, 80 souls at most, half of them children, the rest of them tired adults who worked the river fields and traded their grain twice a year, and never raised a hand against another pack in their lives. They did not have warriors. They did not have walls. They had a granary, a hall, a well, and a single old wolf master who was 63 years old and walked with a stick. They had no reason to be on anyone's map. The Bonecrest pack hit the village an hour before dawn. They came down out of the pines in 2 lines, in wolf form, and they did not stop to talk. By the time Lyra came over the last ridge with her pack of stolen flour on her shoulder, she could already smell what was happening. She dropped the flour. She ran toward the smoke instead of away. She still did not understand why. She had no one in Westmarsh. She owed no one in Westmarsh. The hall was on fire when she got there. The well was full of bodies. A man she did not know was crawling across the road with his guts in his hands, and he told her before he died that the children were in the granary. The granary was burning too. She kicked the door in and they were piled against the back wall like a single small animal trying to be smaller. 23 of them. Some bleeding. Some too quiet. Some screaming so hard they could not see her. She got them out through the floor. There was a grain chute under the boards. She lifted them down one at a time. She carried Bren under her coat because he could not walk. She herded them up the creek bed because the creek bed had no scent for trackers. She did not stop until the 3rd night, when she finally turned them up the canyon toward Hollow Reach. She walked the creek in the freezing water on purpose. The freezing water cracked her boots and split the skin on her ankles, and she did not stop. She would not let the trackers have a scent line. She made the bigger pups walk and the smaller pups ride on the backs of the bigger pups, and when a small one cried, she did not shush them, because shushing a child only makes them cry louder. She knelt down in the cold creek instead, and she said, very plainly, listen to me. We are not going to die tonight. You are not going to die tonight. But you have to be quiet, because the men who are looking for us are tired and they will give up at the next bend if we are quiet. That was a lie. The men were not going to give up at the next bend. But the child stopped crying, and Lyra picked her up and they kept walking. She did not know yet that the Bonecrest pack had already declared a bounty on every pup who had crawled out of Westmarsh alive. She found out from a trapper she nearly killed at the mouth of the canyon. He was a small, wiry man with 2 missing fingers, and she had a knife to his throat before he could say her name. He raised his hands very slowly. He told her the Bonecrest Alpha had sent runners down to every village within 3 days' ride. 20 silver crowns a head for any pup with the Westmarsh sigil on the back of the neck. 40 if they were brought breathing. The trapper said the bounty had only one rule attached to it. The pups had to be presented to the Bonecrest Alpha in person. Lyra asked why. The trapper said he did not know. He said he did not want to know. He said he had a daughter once. Then he asked her, very quietly, not to kill him, and she did not. She let him go down the canyon trail, and she watched him until he was a dot, and then she went back to the cave and counted the pups twice. That was the night she started boiling river water and tearing her own shirt into bandages. That was the night she understood that no one would come. That was the night the cave stopped being a hiding place and became a fort. Now here's the thing about lichen politics that the elders never teach the Omegas. There is always a king. There is always an enforcer. And when a slaughter like Westmarsh happens, the king has exactly 2 choices, and both of them cost him something. The new Alpha King was Kalen Vrast. He had taken the throne 9 months earlier after his father coughed blood at the dinner table and did not stand up again. Kalen was 31 years old. He had a thick neck and a scarred jaw and eyes the color of wet slate. He had killed 2 challengers in his first month. He had broken a treaty in his second. He had married no one. He kept one enforcer at his right hand at all times, a man named Marek Thorne, who had been raised in the war kennels and who had never once in his life been seen to smile. When the news of Westmarsh reached the throne hall, Kalen Vrast did not speak for a long time. The report said 23 children were missing. The report said the Bonecrest pack had put a bounty on those children. The report said someone, no one knew who, had pulled them out of the granary before the fire took the rafters. Kalen Vrast stood up from his chair. He walked to the window. He looked out at the snow. Marek Thorne behind him asked the question without asking it. Send me, the silence said. I will clean this up. I will find the witnesses. I will end the bounty by ending the carriers of it. That is what an enforcer does. That is what an enforcer is for. Kalen Vrast turned around. He looked at Marek Thorne for a long time. And then he said something that none of the council had ever heard him say before. He said, saddle my own horse. He said, 12 riders. He said, no banners. He said, we go tonight. The council protested. The council always protested. Kalen Vrast walked past them without answering, and he went down to the kennels, and he did saddle his own horse, with his own hands, the way he had not done since he was a boy. Marek Thorne stood in the doorway and watched him do it. Marek Thorne said only one thing. He said, my king, do you know who pulled those children out of the fire? And Kalen Vrast said, I have a suspicion. And Marek Thorne said, then you know why I have to ride beside you and not behind. And Kalen Vrast did not answer that either, but he nodded once, very small, and Marek Thorne went to saddle his own horse without another word. Up in the canyon, Lyra Vane did not know any of this. She knew only that the wind had shifted that morning. She knew only that her oldest pup, Kessa, had crawled to the mouth of the cave at first light and had whispered, Lady, There is no bird song. Lyra had gone to the curtain of vines, and she had listened. The girl was right. The canyon was holding its breath. Lyra had taken her knife from the rock where she kept it, and she had sat down at the cave mouth, and she had begun, very calmly, to sharpen it. She did not say anything to the pups. She did not need to. Bren came and laid his head against her thigh, and she stroked his hair with her free hand, and she sharpened the knife with the other, and she waited. 3 hours passed. Then 4. Bren fell asleep against her leg. Kessa brought her a tin cup of melted snow, and she drank it without taking her eyes off the trail. The sun moved across the canyon, and the shadows shortened and lengthened again. Nothing came. By dusk she had begun to think, almost to hope, that the wind had only been weather after all. She set the knife down. She took a long, slow breath. She let it out. She wiped her hands on a clean strip of cloth. She turned for the first time in hours to look at the pups behind her, to count them, because counting them was the small ritual she did at every turning of the day. 1, 2, 3. She got to 23. She put her hand on her chest, briefly, the way a woman does when a tight thing inside her eases for a moment. She walked back into the cave. She sat down by the fire. She picked up the tin cup of snowmelt and she took another slow sip, because the danger had passed, because nothing was coming, because the wind had only been wind. The crack of a stick outside the cave was so small that, if she had not spent 18 months alone in the wilderness, she would not have heard it. She set the cup down without spilling a drop. Lyra was on her feet with the knife in her hand before the second stick cracked. She did not run to the cave mouth. She ran to the pups. She gathered Bren first because he was the lightest. She passed him to Kessa, and she said, "Into the deep," the words she had drilled into them every night for a week. Into the deep meant the back tunnel. Into the deep meant the bend where the cave folded into itself and went down 10 feet into a shelf of black rock that no torch from the front could see. Kessa took Bren. Kessa took 2 more. Then she came back for 2 more. The pups moved without speaking. Lyra had trained them. The girl who did not speak led 3 by the hand. Ayla with the wrong jaw carried the smallest one against her own chest. Tomas with the burned hands could not lift, but he could heard, and he heard it. In 90 seconds the cave behind her was empty, and Lyra Vane stood alone at the mouth with the knife in her left hand and her right hand flat against the rock wall, because the rock wall was the only thing in her life that had ever held her up. The first man through the vines was a Bonecrest tracker. He had a scar across his mouth and a notched ear. He carried a short blade and a length of rope, and the rope had small loops in it, child-sized loops, and Lyra saw the loops first, and she understood. She did not let him finish a sentence. She moved. She had been training on her own body for 18 months. She had been training on dead trees and old stumps. She had never killed a man before. She killed this one in the time it took him to lift the rope. She did it quietly, with the knife under his jaw, and she lowered him to the floor of the cave so the man behind him would not hear him fall. The man behind him was bigger and slower, and he came through the vines half laughing because he expected to find a den of frightened children. Lyra was on him before the laugh finished. He got his arm up. She took the arm anyway. He got his blade out. She took the blade too. He went down with a sound she would hear in her sleep for the rest of her life. There were 2 more outside. She could hear them on the slope. She did not wait. She stepped out through the vines with both knives now, and the world outside the cave was blue and cold and full of the kind of dusk that makes everything look like the edge of a knife. And the 2 men below saw her, and they reached for their horns to call others, and she did not let them blow the horns. She was fast. She had been told she was fast since she was 6 years old. She had never believed it until that night. When it was done, she stood on the slope above 4 dead men. Her arm was bleeding through her sleeve. Her left ear was ringing. She had a cut on her cheek she did not remember taking. The canyon was very quiet again. She turned around to walk back to the cave. And that was when she heard the hooves. Not 4 hooves. Not 8. Many hooves. A column. She came down off the slope on shaking legs. She did not run for the cave. If she ran for the cave, they would find the cave. She stood in the middle of the canyon trail, in plain sight, with 2 bloody knives, and she waited. She thought, if I die here, the pups have until morning. The pups can crawl down the back of Hollow Reach. Kessa knows the way. Kessa is 11. Kessa will get them out. Lyra thought that is enough. Lyra thought that is more than enough. If you have ever loved a thing that was not yours and chosen it anyway, you know exactly how she was standing in that road. If you're still with me, hit that subscribe button. It tells me you want the rest of these. The first rider came around the bend, with a sword already drawn. The second rider had a crossbow on his shoulder. The third was bigger than the first 2 combined. They saw her. They slowed. They did not stop. There were 12 of them. There was a 13th, riding 2 lengths ahead of the column on a horse the color of iron. He was the one who lifted his hand, and the column halted. He was the Alpha King. She did not know it yet. She knew only that a man in a long black coat with a thick neck and a scarred jaw had ridden up to her with his hand raised, and that he had not drawn a weapon, and that he was looking at her the way no one had looked at her since she was a child, which is to say, like he was about to lose something. He said her name. He said Lyra. Just that. Just the one word. She did not lower the knives. He swung down off the horse. He did not draw a weapon. The big enforcer behind him, Marek Thorn, started to move, and the king lifted one hand without looking back, and Marek Thorn went still. The king walked toward Lyra slowly. He stopped 6 feet away. He looked at the blood on her sleeve. He looked at the cut on her cheek. He looked at the 4 dead Bonecrest men on the slope behind her, and his jaw worked, and then he looked at her again and he said, "Are they alive?" He did not say who. He did not need to. She said yes. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. When he opened them, he said, "My name is Kalen Vrast. I am the Alpha King. I was told you were dead 12 years ago. I was told you died in a fever. I was told your grave was in the orchard behind the old hall. I went there every spring. I am telling you this so you understand why I am about to do something you will not believe." He went down on one knee. In the snow. In front of her. The 12 riders behind him made a sound that was not a sound, a small intake of breath that ran down the column like wind through wheat. Marek Thorn, behind the king, lowered his head and did not lift it again until the king stood up. The king said, "You are my father's daughter. He had you taken to the orchard pack when you were 10, and you were small for 10, and he told my mother you had a fever, and he told me you had a fever, and he buried a coffin full of stones. I learned the truth 4 months ago. I have been looking for you since. I did not know it was you in that granary until tonight." Lyra Vane stood with 2 bloody knives in her hands, and she heard the words, but the words were like something underwater. She heard "my father's daughter." She heard "I have been looking." She heard the orchard pack. The orchard pack was the pack that had raised her. The orchard pack was the pack that had called her Omega and disowned her and turned her out into the snow. She started to laugh, and the laugh came out wrong, like a cough, and she stopped it. She said, "The pups." He said, "Yes." "The pups." She said, "The bounty." He said, "The bounty ends tonight." She said, "The Bonecrest Alpha." He said, "The Bonecrest Alpha will answer for Westmarsh by sunrise tomorrow, and not to me. To you. If you want it." She lowered the knives slowly, because her hands had been locked around them so long she was not sure she could open her fingers. He saw that, and he did not move to help her. That was the thing she remembered later, the small mercy of it, that he had let her lower her own knives by herself. When her hands were finally empty, he said, "May I go to them?" She nodded. She turned. She walked back up to the cave. He walked behind her. Marek Thorn and 12 riders walked behind him, and not one of them spoke. She pushed aside the vines. She said into the dark, "It's me, you can come up." Kessa came first. Kessa had a knife of her own. Kessa saw the column of men outside, and Kessa lifted the knife. Lyra knelt down in front of her and put a hand on the girl's wrist and said, "It's safe." It took Kessa a long moment to lower the knife. Bren came up behind her. Bren saw the king. Bren did not know who the king was. Bren only saw a large man in a black coat, and large men in black coats had been the worst thing in Bren's small life, and Bren turned his face into Lyra's leg and clung. The king did not move closer. The king sat down on a rock at the cave mouth. He sat down at 4-year-old eye level. He took off his gloves. He laid them on his knee. He did not speak. He waited. It was Ayla who came up to him first, Ayla with the wrong jaw, who had been called ugly her whole short life. She walked up to him and she touched his sleeve. She said, "Are you the king?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you going to take us away?" He said, "Only if you want to come." She said, "Are you going to hurt her?" And she pointed at Lyra. The king looked at her for a long time. He said, "No." He said, "I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure no one does." She walked back into the cave first. The king stayed at the mouth. He did not push past her. She understood later that he had done that on purpose, because the cave was hers, and he was not going to take a single inch of it from her unless she gave it. She walked in alone. She knelt down in the dark at the bend in the tunnel. She said in the voice she used for them, "You can all come up now. There is a man at the door. He says he is my brother. I do not know yet if that is true. But the danger is over. Come up slowly. Hold each other's hands." By midnight the pups were wrapped in real blankets from the saddlebags. By midnight Bren was eating warm broth from a tin cup that Marek Thorne, of all people,